When you think about basketry, tree bark may not be the first thing that comes to mind. Yet tree bark is one of the most versatile materials that you can use in basketry. It may sound obvious to say it, but there's just as many types of tree barks as there are different types of trees, and they all have different properties. Some of them, like linden or cedar, can be pounded down into a fiber. For this video, I'm going to focus on what I know best, which is harvesting willow bark or big leaf maple bark. Although the techniques I show you here can be used for many different types of tree bark. Here, I've got some hazel bark. I love this material so much I had to break this down into two different videos. In this one I'll show you how I sustainably and responsibly harvest fresh bark, and in the second one I'll show you a little bit about how I use this material and hopefully give you some ideas of what you can do with it. So let's jump in. Rule number 1, bark peeling has to happen in the spring or early summer, when the sap is rising. Find someone doing some spring pruning. Here I am in my neighbor's yard and they were trimming their weeping willow. The first thing you want to do is cut a long line down the entire length of the branch. And I'm going to do that where this bark is starting to come off here where it's already splitting. So I'm going to line up my cut right there. And it actually works better if you use your thumb and forefinger as a guide on either side of the branch while holding the knife. I just kind of forgot. Use a twig that you've cut an angle into and use that to start to lift the bark on both sides of the cut. If it's a smaller branch like this, you should be able to just use your hands for the rest of it. Just go slow and take your time. You're trying to get the bark off all in one piece. And let me back up a bit to tell you, when you're first starting out, try to find a long branch without any side branches. All natural material has to go through an initial drying stage. As it loses moisture, it'll shrink. Wrap the bark up in a circle and make sure that you turn it back onto itself so that the outside of the tree bark is now on the inside. This will make the bark much easier to work with when you go to re-soak it and use it. If you wrap it the other way around, it will dry all curled in on itself and it will be harder to work with later on. You might be surprised how much you can get just from your neighbor trimming their willow tree. In the spring, I'm always on high alert for bark removal. These trees were cut down by the city, down by the railroad tracks. I like to wear the safety vest when working in the ditches or the roadsides, mostly just because no one questions you. If you're not sure what kind of tree it is, take a look at the buds. This one was a poplar. For bigger logs like this, it's good to have a bigger tool. This is a mini pry bar. My husband found it for me in a hardware store. It's really come in handy. This next section I narrated while I was harvesting, so just a warning, the audio levels are quite different. We had some really high winds about a week ago, and it looks like this maple tree snapped and lost this branch in that storm. So what I'm going to do is harvest some of this bark. There's another branch around the other side I'm going to try first. So this branch must have come off earlier, before last week, because it's actually quite dry. And really, if you're doing it right, it should be actually quite moist under there. This one, the bark is a lot more moist and is peeling off quite easily. You can see the fresh, has a fresh kind of a color to it even, as opposed to that last piece. So find a stick where you can make a angled cut like that, and you can use that to lift the bark. Run it down both sides of that cut. Immediately I can tell that this bark is much more fresh. This branch came down much more recently than that last branch. And you should actually be able to hear that sound. And that's what you want. And any bark that I've harvested, generally it's usually maple or it's willow, and this is the state that I harvest it in. I've created a cut along the circumference of the branch, and that's where this piece of bark will end when I peel it off. Can you tell? A basket maker's been there. And if you don't have your entire toolkit with you, you can always use the bark peeled from a small sapling to tie up your rolls. Some of your bark will come off in beautiful, long, flat strips. Other pieces, not so much. You'll end up with pieces with holes from the side branches and some interesting tears. In some ways, this piece will be harder to work with, but in other ways, it has a lot of character. Personally, I would never remove a piece of bark from a still living tree. There's a chance you could kill the tree. Between spring pruning and windfall, there's plenty of opportunity to sustainably harvest bark. In the next video, I'll show you how I use the bark in my creative projects, sometimes in a more traditional way, and sometimes in a way maybe you hadn't thought of.